Welcome back to the deep dive. We love taking those big, fascinating topics that you're probably really curious about and breaking them down in a way that helps you really get it. Not just a surface level understanding, but something that leaves you feeling truly informed.
Exactly.
And today, we're going deep, diving into a concept that's absolutely central to Christian thought.
Yeah, sin.
And to help us unpack all the different layers of this idea, we're going to be drawing some really insightful perspectives from a pretty cool source.
The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Now I know what you might be thinking. Philosophy.
Right.
Doesn't sound like the most exciting way to spend an afternoon, but trust me on this.
This is going to be good. We've tailored this deep dive to be insightful, maybe even a little surprising. We're aiming to give you those aha moments where things really click into place.
Absolutely. And the thing about sin is it's so much more than just a list of rules or do's and don'ts. Christian philosophy actually offers a really rich and varied landscape of ideas about what sin truly is and what it means for us as humans.
It goes way beyond simply doing something wrong.
Yeah, we're going to be exploring how sin might be woven into our deepest inclinations, even considered a fundamental part of our existence.
That's right.
And we'll also touch on how sin can even warp our thinking and how it plays out in the structures of our societies. Goes deep, right?
It does.
So our mission today is to really dig into those core philosophical understandings of sin within, specifically contemporary Christian analytic theology.
We want to give you a clear and engaging overview of this topic because I know it can feel a little dense at times.
Okay, so I think a good starting point for us is to address the question of why are we specifically focusing on a religious understanding of sin?
Right.
Why not just approach it from a more general, religion-neutral perspective on what's right and wrong, like a basic value system?
That's a great question, and it's really important to address that right at the beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, some philosophical approaches do try to create ethical systems that could apply to anyone, no matter what they believe.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But one of the most important thinkers in this area, Marilyn McCord Adams, actually challenges this idea of religion-neutral value theory. She argues that deep down, people who believe in God and people who don't actually have really different views about what's ultimately real, about how the world works.
Right, and she calls those fundamental differences ontological commitments.
Exactly. These basic beliefs shape everything else. How you see good and bad, and ultimately what constitutes sin.
It's like looking at the world through different lenses almost. So within Christian thought, this idea of an infinite personal God who wants a relationship with us, that totally changes how you understand when things go wrong in that relationship.
Right. A purely secular system just doesn't have that same framework. It's really fascinating.
Okay, so within this Christian worldview then, a really crucial concept we need to understand is that sin is often seen as a privation.
Okay.
But just to be clear, when we say privation, we're not talking about physical hardship or lack of material things. It's more about the absence of something that should be there, something good.
So it's not so much a thing in itself, but rather a lack of a thing.
Yeah, exactly. Like a void or an emptiness where something positive ought to be. And this is actually really important because if sin were its own positive entity, something that exists on its own, well, it would create a big theological problem.
Right, because Christians believe that God is the ultimate creator.
Yeah, the source of everything.
So if sin were a positive thing, God would, in a sense, be responsible for creating it. And that contradicts this core Christian belief in God's goodness.
It's like, you can't have a good God creating something that is inherently evil. It just doesn't add up.
Right. Christian philosopher Paul Copan, he makes this really insightful point, too, that if we overemphasize how bad humans are without also acknowledging the inherent goodness of creation, we get a really distorted picture.
So it's all connected. These ideas about God, creation, sin, it all kind of weaves together, right?
Absolutely. You can't really separate them out.
Our understanding of sin is deeply intertwined with other core Christian beliefs.
Right, like how the world was created, the nature of Christ, and the concept of atonement, how we're reconciled with God. These things are all linked.
You can't really pull on one thread without affecting the others. And this is where it gets super interesting because you see all these different metaphors used in Scripture to try to capture this complex idea of sin.
Metaphors? Like what?
Well, you see it portrayed as a stain, for example.
Okay.
Something that needs cleansing.
Makes sense.
Or a burden, something that weighs us down.
Yeah.
Or even as a debt that needs to be repaid or forgiven.
So these metaphors, they're not just poetic ways of talking about sin. They
Right.
really shape how we understand it and therefore how we respond to it.
Right.
If you see sin as a stain, you're naturally going to think about cleansing.
Yeah.
A burden needs lifting. A debt needs some kind of resolution.
And this is something that Gary Anderson, a scholar of religion, has actually explored really deeply. He points out that the dominant metaphor for sin can even shift across different parts of the Bible, which gives us all these different angles to approach this complex issue.
It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of concept.
Exactly. Okay, so let's get into some of the specific ways Christian philosophers have tried to unpack this idea of sin.
Okay.
And a really common starting point is to think about sin as an action. This is probably what comes to mind first for most people. Specific things we do or don't do that are wrong in God's eyes.
It's about our behavior, our choices.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But when we talk about actions, it's important to think broadly. It's not just about actively doing bad things, what theologians often call commissions. It also includes omissions.
Omissions.
Yeah, like failing to show love to your neighbor, even if you don't actively harm them.
Okay, that makes sense.
So basically, it's about not living up to what God expects of us, whether through our actions or our inactions.
It's falling short.
Yeah, and a lot of times, these sinful actions involve, well, a choice, a deliberate choice. In fact, the theologian Ruth Granout, building on Augustine's work, she defines sin properly so-called, as often understood as making a deliberate choice of a lesser good over a greater one. And that choice is made despite God's will, even against his love.
Augustine's idea of privation really comes into play here too, right?
Absolutely.
It's not about choosing something that's inherently evil. It's more about turning away from something better.
It's so true. We rarely set out intentionally to do something purely evil. It's more often that we're just drawn to things that seem good or pleasurable or easy in the moment, even when deep down we know, yeah, this isn't the best choice or this goes against my values. And the thing is, it's not just the outward action that counts. Even internally agreeing with a sin,
Yeah.
even if you don't actually do it, can be considered sinful.
Absolutely. I mean, think about the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
Jesus says that being angry with someone is like murder in your heart, and looking at someone with lust is like adultery in your heart.
Yeah, it's really about the intent, the state of your heart.
Right, your internal state, your dispositions, these matter too.
Okay, so this is where things get even trickier. Right?
Yeah.
Because what about involuntary or unintentional sins? Like if someone does something wrong without meaning to, or even without realizing it was wrong, can you really hold them fully accountable for that?
That's a tough one. Some Christian thinkers, like Robert Adams, argue that even with those involuntary emotions or those motives that seem to come out of nowhere, we still have a responsibility to acknowledge them and own them.
That's interesting.
Failing to do that can be harmful, to yourself or to others, even if it's not as blameworthy as a deliberate sin.
Right, because you're not really taking responsibility for your inner life.
Yeah.
And then Richard Swinburne, he actually distinguishes between what he calls objective sins and subjective sins, which I think is really helpful here.
So objective sin is when you do something that's actually wrong, like objectively morally wrong.
Exactly. Whether you know it's wrong or not. And then subjective sin is when you do something that you believe is wrong, even if it actually isn't objectively.
So you could have a situation where someone does something that's objectively wrong, like breaks a moral rule, but they don't actually know it's wrong. So they're not really culpable in the same way. And then conversely, you could have someone do something that they think is wrong, but objectively it's perfectly fine.
Yeah. And Philip Quinn, he actually points out that this idea of subjective sin is really important for people who believe that even an erring conscience still binds you.
An erring conscience.
Yeah, like when you genuinely believe something is wrong, even if your understanding is actually mistaken.
Okay, that's fascinating. So all this talk about sin and actions and intentions, it really connects to this bigger philosophical question, doesn't it?
The problem of evil.
Exactly, especially what we call moral evil.
The evil that's caused by human choices and actions.
Right. And for anyone who believes in an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God, this is a real head-scratcher. If God is so good and so powerful, why does he allow all this terrible stuff to happen?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And this is where Alvin Plantinga's famous free will defense comes into the picture.
Free will defense.
It's an attempt to grapple with that question, why a good God would allow evil. And basically what Plantinga argues is that God's choice to create humans with genuine freedom, with the ability to make real choices, that means there's always a possibility of choosing wrongly, of sinning.
And God has to constantly intervene and stop us from making those wrong choices.
Right, because that would go against the idea of free will.
Exactly. So Plantinga says that for any being that God creates with true freedom, there's this inherent risk.
The risk of sin.
Yeah, the risk of choosing badly. And he even suggests that for beings created in God's image with intellect and will, there might be this really strong temptation.
To do what?
Well, to want God's position for themselves, which could make sin even more likely.
Wow, that's a pretty bold claim.
It is, and it's important to point out that Plantinga's argument hinges on a libertarian view of free will.
Libertarian.
Yeah, the idea that our choices aren't ultimately determined by prior causes. We have a genuine ability to choose differently in any situation. So if that's true, then God can't guarantee that we'll always choose good without basically overriding our free will.
So this raises the really thorny question of how does God relate to our sinful actions if God is all-powerful, if he's involved in everything?
Right.
How can God not be somehow implicated in sin?
Right, and this is a real sticking point, especially for people who believe in compatibilism or theological determinism.
Okay, can you break those down for us?
Compatibilism is the idea that free will and determinism can coexist somehow, that even if our choices are ultimately predetermined, we can still be free in a meaningful sense.
Okay.
And theological determinism goes even further. It claims that God ultimately causes all events, including our choices.
So in that view, everything is ultimately ordained by God.
Right. And that obviously raises lots of questions about how to reconcile that with human responsibility for sin.
Yeah, that's a whole other deep dive we could do.
Definitely. But the point is that how we understand sin and how we understand free will are closely connected.
They go hand in hand.
And all of this ties into these big theological ideas about forgiveness, redemption, and atonement.
Right, because if sin is a real problem, we need a real solution. And different Christian traditions have different views on what that solution looks like. But they all agree that sin needs to be dealt with somehow.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about sin as action in general, but I think it's worth zooming in on a very particular kind of sinful action.
Yeah.
Primal sin.
Primal sin.
Yeah, the very first sin, the one that kicked off the whole cycle of sin and evil.
It's like the ultimate origin story, right?
Right. And Scott McDonald, who's a philosopher, he describes it as a paradigm case. It's the classic example of a free choice that brings evil into existence. It's not just that it's chronologically the first sin, it's also radically new.
Radically new.
Yeah, it emerges from a state of perfect goodness.
So there's nothing before it to explain why this turn toward evil happens.
Exactly. And this idea of primal sin often suggests a time before the fall, when creation was perfect. But the theologian Craig Boyd points out that this idea can create some tension, especially when you consider what we know from modern science.
Right, because science tells us the universe has always involved death and suffering. It's not like there was this pristine period of perfect harmony followed by a sudden fall.
Exactly. So even if we don't interpret the Genesis account literally, we're still left with this really fundamental question.
How did evil begin?
Right. John Hick, another philosopher, called this the problem of the origin of evil ex nihilo. How does this desire for evil arise in beings who were created good? How does evil come from nothing?
It's a tough one. And to answer that question, there are two main philosophical approaches that try to explain primal sin.
Okay. Which are?
Voluntarism and intellectualism.
So voluntarism focuses on the will.
Right. The idea that primal sin comes from a misuse or misdirection of our free will.
Okay.
And then intellectualism focuses on the intellect, suggesting that the first sin must have started with some failure to understand or some error in judgment.
Interesting. Can you give us an example of each approach?
Yeah, definitely. So for voluntarism, we can look at Anselm.
Anselm.
Yeah, and the philosopher Catherine Rogers, she offers a really helpful breakdown of his view.
Okay, so how did Anselm understand primal sin?
Well, he believed that free will involves two main inclinations: the desire for benefit and the desire for justice.
Benefit and justice. Okay, can you unpack those a little?
Yeah, so benefit is basically wanting things that bring pleasure or happiness.
Yeah.
Seeking out what's good for yourself.
Okay, that makes sense. And justice.
Justice is more of a higher order desire. It's about wanting your desires to be rightly ordered, to be in line with what's truly good and right.
So it's not just about getting what you want.
Right. It's about wanting what's good in a more objective sense, even if it goes against your immediate desires.
Okay, that's really interesting. So where does sin come in?
Well, Anselm argued that no one actually wills injustice for its own sake.
Right.
They always choose it because they think it will bring them some benefit, even if it's a misguided benefit.
So it's about getting something out of it.
Yeah. But the question then becomes, why would someone choose a lesser good, like personal benefit, over a higher good, like justice, or aligning with God's will?
That's the key question, right?
Exactly. And Anselm's answer is that they just willed
They
it.
just willed it.
Yeah, it's an act of their will.
So it's not about lacking knowledge or being deceived.
Right, it's a choice. But ultimately, Rogers argues that Anselm saw this choice as somewhat mysterious, maybe even irrational. It's a fundamental misuse of freedom. So from that perspective, the very first sin, the turn towards evil, is almost impossible to fully explain. It's just this basic consequence of having free will.
Okay, that's a lot to think about. So what about the intellectualist perspective? You mentioned Augustine.
Yeah, Augustine is a great example, and Scott McDonald offers this really fascinating interpretation of his view. He argues that for Augustine, while the will is involved, the first sin is actually preceded by a failure of the intellect.
So it's a kind of intellectual stumbling block that leads to the sin.
Right. McDonald suggests that the first humans, they failed to fully grasp or appreciate the overwhelming reasons for loving God above all else. If they had truly focused on what they knew about God's goodness, his beauty, they would have seen that reason itself demands that we love God the most.
So it's not so much a deliberate rebellion as a failure to understand the true nature of things.
Exactly. They had the knowledge, but they didn't give those right reasons their proper weight.
And this faulty judgment then influenced their will.
Yeah, exactly. And Augustine wasn't the only intellectualist who tackled this. You've also got Aquinas, who built upon Augustine's ideas, although he developed them in his own unique way. And then there's Jonathan Edwards, the American theologian. He had his own spin on intellectualism, arguing that the will always follows the strongest motivation.
Which, in turn, is shaped by the intellect.
Right, so ultimately, your choices are guided by your understanding of what's good and desirable. And even Plantinga, in some of his more recent writings, suggests that primal sin must involve some kind of intellectual defect.
Some kind of false belief or misjudgment.
Yeah, he calls it a prior intellectual fault. And this fault then sets the stage for those disordered desires and affections.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here with sin as action.
We have.
And we explored the mystery of primal sin.
Yeah. But I think now it's time to shift gears a bit and talk about sin as a disposition.
A disposition.
Yeah, this is the idea that sin isn't just about individual acts. It's also about our underlying tendencies, our inclinations.
So it's more about who we are at our core.
Right. And Plantinga, for example, describes sin in this sense as an affective disorder.
An affective disorder.
Yeah, he's basically saying that sin involves a malfunction in our desires and affections.
So instead of desiring and valuing God above all else,
Right. We start seeking our own glory, our own self-aggrandizement. It's like we have this tendency to love ourselves more than we love God or others. And the relationship between those sinful dispositions and our actions can get pretty complicated.
how so?
Well, think about it. Let's say you have a strong inclination towards greed, right?
Right.
That might make it way easier for you to act selfishly, but it doesn't mean you'll automatically be greedy in every situation.
Right. There's still a choice involved.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we saw this earlier with primal sin. Even the very first sin doesn't require some pre-existing sinful disposition.
Right. It's the act that kind of kicks off that whole chain of events.
Yeah, exactly. Now, when we talk about sin as disposition, it really connects to this whole framework of virtue ethics.
Virtue ethics.
Yeah, it's a philosophical approach that emphasizes character development and moral habits.
So it's not just about following rules, but about becoming a good person.
Exactly. And in virtue ethics, vices are seen as those deep-seated habits that actually work against human flourishing.
They're like the opposite of virtues.
Exactly. Aquinas, he had a pretty strict view. He really only considered actions as being sinful. But the broader Christian tradition has recognized both actions and dispositions as falling under the umbrella of sin.
It's about both what we do and who we are.
Right. It's about those inner tendencies that can lead us astray. And this idea of sin as a disposition, it leads straight to the concept of sanctification.
Sanctification.
Yeah, it's that lifelong process of becoming more like Christ.
So it's not just about avoiding bad actions.
Right. It's also about transforming those deep-seated sinful inclinations within us.
It's about changing from the inside out.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about sin as an action and as a disposition, but now let's dive into something that might be a little less obvious. sin as a state.
Sin as a state.
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
Well, it's about understanding sin as a kind of ontological condition, a fundamental aspect of our being.
So not something we do, but something we are.
Right. And Marilyn McCord Adams, who we mentioned earlier, she has this really intriguing and unconventional perspective on this. She suggests that at its core, sin can be understood as a kind of ontological uncleanness.
Uncleanness.
Yeah. And it's not primarily about those specific wrongdoings or moral failures. It's more about this inherent kind of mismatch
Mismatch between what?
between our human nature and the divine nature.
So it's like this built-in tension or distance.
Exactly. So it's not something we do to become unclean. It's more like a consequence of our very nature as created finite beings.
Okay, so we're inherently unclean because we're not God.
Right. Adams argues that this uncleanness stems from this fundamental difference, this gap between the perfect being of God and our limited, finite human existence.
So it's just a necessary consequence of what we are.
Yeah. She calls it incommensurability, and she emphasizes that this is like a metaphysical reality, not the direct result of our choices.
Wow, that's a pretty different way to think about sin. So if it's not about our actions, how do we overcome this uncleanness?
Well, Adams really emphasizes the covenant relationship between God and humanity and the incarnation of Christ.
The incarnation.
Yeah, like God becoming human in Jesus.
Okay.
And she sees this as the primary way to bridge that fundamental gap.
So it's God's initiative, not ours, that ultimately makes things right.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about sin as action, sin as disposition, sin as a state. And now I think it's time to unpack another really big concept, original sin.
Yeah, this is a cornerstone of so much of Christian theology, but it can be a real head-scratcher.
It definitely can.
Okay, so how is original sin different from primal sin? We've already talked about that first sin that set things in motion.
Right. So primal sin was that first sin. Original sin is, well, it's original in the sense that it's this evil that exists at the very origin of human agency.
So it's like a foundational corruption.
Exactly. It's something that all subsequent human agency flows from in a certain way. It's sometimes described as having a sinful nature. But that language can be tricky because of issues around Christ being fully human but also sinless, and in some traditions, Mary being sinless. So it's probably better to think of original sin as this fundamental distortion or corruption of human nature that makes us more prone to sin.
Okay, so it's not that we're born guilty of Adam's sin, but we've inherited this tendency towards sinfulness.
Exactly. And it's interesting to note that even though the doctrine isn't explicitly laid out in the Bible, like in a systematic way, it developed over time based on different biblical passages.
Yeah, and it's specifically a Christian doctrine, not really something you see in Judaism or Islam in the same way.
Right. And Augustine, he played a really huge role in shaping this doctrine, especially in his debates with Pelagius. He was a monk who believed that humans are born morally neutral.
So no original sin?
Exactly. He thought sin is purely a matter of individual choices.
Okay, so Augustine strongly disagreed with that.
He did. Augustine argued that because of Adam's sin, the entire human race is bound by this chain of death and justly condemned. We inherit this fundamentally corrupted nature.
So we're born into this state of sinfulness because of Adam.
Right. And theologian Jesse Kernhoven, he helpfully breaks down Augustine's doctrine into 5 key parts.
5 parts.
Yeah. So first you've got the primal sin itself, Adam's disobedience. Then there's this idea that all of humanity somehow participated in that first sin.
Wait, how can we participate in a sin that happened before we were even born?
Well, it's based on this idea of solidarity with Adam, that as the first human, he represents all of humanity.
Okay.
Then the third part is inherited guilt, the idea that we're somehow held responsible for Adam's sin, even though we didn't choose it.
It's a tough one to swallow.
It is. And then the fourth part is this penalty to human nature, the corruption or wounding of our being that resulted from the fall. And finally, the fifth part is the transmission of this inherited sin and its consequences to all future generations.
So we're talking about a legacy of sin passed down from generation to generation.
Right. And we've already talked about primal sin, and the idea of transmission has various interpretations. So let's maybe focus on those third and fourth points.
Okay, the inherited fault and the original guilt.
Exactly. So what is this constitutional fault we inherit? Kernhoven describes it as this fundamental moral improper functioning as human beings.
So like a defect in our moral makeup.
Yeah, it's an inherited state characterized by disordered desires. Our desires aren't naturally aligned with what's truly good.
So we're naturally drawn to the wrong things.
Right. And we also have this impaired understanding of what's right.
So, like, our moral compass is off.
Exactly. It's often described as this loss of original righteousness.
Okay, and this then brings us to this highly debated idea of original guilt.
The notion that we're morally guilty for this fault, even before we've committed any personal sins.
Yeah, that we're somehow blameworthy for something we didn't do.
Right, and this is where things get really controversial.
You can imagine.
A lot of contemporary philosophers and theologians push back hard on this idea.
They don't think we can be held guilty for something Adam did.
Exactly.
It doesn't seem fair.
Right. While some argue that original guilt is essential to the doctrine of original sin, many hold what are called corruption-only doctrines. They argue that we inherit the corrupted nature and its consequences, but we're not morally culpable for that state itself.
So we're messed up, but not guilty.
Right. And one of the main objections to original guilt is that it seems to violate what's called the principle of possible prevention.
Okay, break that down for us.
It's the idea that you can only be held responsible for something that you could have prevented.
Right, that makes sense.
And since none of us could have stopped Adam from sinning, a lot of people argue that it's just not fair to hold us guilty for it.
Okay, so how do those who do affirm original guilt respond to that objection?
Well, philosophers like Michael Rea have offered some really complex arguments trying to reconcile those ideas. He explores all sorts of metaphysical frameworks like philosophical realism and perdurantism.
Perdurantism.
Yeah, it's the idea that individuals persist through time by having different temporal parts, like slices of yourself existing at different points in time.
Okay, that's getting pretty deep.
It is. He also brings in theological ideas like Molinism.
Molinism.
Yeah, it's a view of God's knowledge that tries to reconcile divine foreknowledge with human free will.
Okay, so we're not going to go down that rabbit hole right now, but the point is that people are trying to come up with ways to explain how we could be considered guilty for something we didn't directly do.
Right. These are really complex and nuanced arguments that have faced their own set of challenges. But closely tied to the idea of constitutional fault is the question of just penalty. If we inherit this corruption, this brokenness, is it fair for us to experience negative consequences because of it?
Like punishment for something we didn't choose.
Exactly. Those who reject original guilt say that we should only face negative consequences for our own personal sins, not for Adam's sin.
Right. That makes sense.
But for those who do affirm original guilt, they have to grapple with where that guilt comes from and why it's just for us to be held accountable.
It's like, if we didn't choose to be in this messed up state, how can we be punished for it?
Right. And there are two main theological approaches that try to address this.
Yeah.